Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Unlimited. Today, we are talking about rethinking empowerment and releasing comparison. Last episode, I talked about comparisonitis and how societal norms and the hierarchies in our society feed into this draw of comparing and in the ways that it can feel like it's taking over our life and impacting our self-worth and things of that nature. Empowerment is certainly related, and a lot of people who work in empowerment will talk about comparisonitis and engage it. And some of what we're talking about is there's some overlap there, but in this case, we're looking a little bit more at the stories around empowerment itself and how those stories tie in to societal norms that feed our tendency to compare. And how we engage the reason we make comparisons in order to have a greater self-awareness and societal awareness, especially around the stories that we are fed and sold on to perpetuate a lot of these norms and patterns, so that we can come up with more creative solutions. I do want to note that this podcast is a little bit different than I normally do podcasts, but more aligned with what initiated me starting a podcast in the first place. I'm not sure if I've shared here before that the reason I started a podcast was actually because some women I was in a group messaging with would hear me kind of process things out, like things that I was percolating, and then we're like, you should really start a podcast. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Now, I have made myself a bit more structured when I do a podcast than me just processing things out loud and recording it. But this one did come from some of that. Now, it's not just been out loud processing, but also I've done some writing, and even from the last episode, as I mentioned, kind of fed into what I really wanted to share in this episode and break down and engage with you. And so what we're going to be talking about are rethinking empowerment, walking through change, the influence of norms, buying out of the fantasy, using comparisons for self-reflection. Because this is really a processing and it is coming from conversations. It's coming from conversations with other people directly, indirectly, from trainings I've invested in, books that I've read, and even my work with clients and what's coming forward with that and my own life. I would love to hear from you what this brings forward, what comes up for you as you listen, as you think about these things. I would love to know what that is, because these things kind of uncover and advance in conversation, as I will be talking about. Shifting out of some of those norms requires us to shift out of individualism and into a more collective approach. And that means you, because this is just me talking and I want to hear from you. So please, if you feel so moved, send me an email, send me a message on social media, or even reach out and ask if we can have a conversation. I would be happy to chat with you and hear what you're thinking about with this. So with that said, without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Valerie Friedlander, Certified Life Business Alignment Coach, and this is Unlimited. This podcast bridges the individual and the societal, scientific and spiritual, positive and negative, nerdy and no, there's just a lot of nerdy. Come on board and let's unlock a life that's as badass as you are. For a long time, I've struggled with the term empowerment because so often it's used as I empower women to build a life they love, right? Or I empower women to have these things or whatever it is. Even if it's just to feel more confident in their life. I don't think of empowerment that way. Empowerment isn't about me giving you power. It's about me helping you access your own power so you can feel empowered. Now, even if it was me giving you power or somebody giving power, it's more societal. Like, I'm going to give you access to things so that you have more power. But even that isn't about empowerment. It is about removing oppression. So, there's a lot of stuff there. But I was thinking about even that terminology, the thinking about being empowered. I help you access your power to do these things, whatever it is. The way it's used so often, and what's started to bother me about it, is that the concept of empowerment has been co-opted as the way to achieve the life that will bring you joy. So I empower women to feel more confident in their life, or I empower women to create a life they love. And it's this idea that I'm going to be empowered so that I can have this joyful life. And it's not just coaching, it's also product and things like that. Like, you'll feel more empowered, right? Like, those sorts of ideas. And the idea of using empowerment as, well, once you're empowered, then you will have, is tied to this idea of joyful living or whatever. And the problem is that joy doesn't exist in the future. Joy exists in the present. It's not a destination. It's not something you get once you have empowerment. So when it's used in that way, it's essentially tied to a fantasy, a future fantasy. And what I realized is that this is why, when this is what's being sold, it's so often using the trappings and images of societal power and privileges to attract people, because the trappings are familiar. It makes them easier to connect with and project yourself into, to feed the fantasy. Brains love patterns and tend to connect dots. You've heard me say this before. They do associations. And it does this without you even realizing it. It's mostly subconscious. And what it does and how it does this is beyond your control. It's conditioned through years of exposure to societal norms and power dynamics. It's that concept of implicit bias, which, if you're not familiar, I'll have links in the show notes that talk about implicit bias. But if you've heard of it, that's essentially where that comes from. So while you may consciously know that empowerment isn't having a lean, fit body, the dream house, a six-figure business, luxury things, etc. And I'm not saying those things don't matter, because they certainly make a difference in this society. They are correlated, understandably, with choice, control, safety, because having them does give you power. But it's societally constructed power. It's restricted power. It's a contrived fantasy open to a few, but fed to us all. So you may consciously know this, but it's still attractive to our conditioning because it connects to all those associations that we already have in our brains. And the more we consume it, the stronger that association becomes. And this is partly where some of that comparisonitis comes in when we're looking at social media, or when we're watching movies or TV or reading magazines or whatever it is. It's reconditioning these connections until it becomes hard to imagine joy anywhere else, because the connections are so strong, we don't even notice them. So we correlate without awareness, and this is what is true, and this is what is familiar to our brains. This is what's known, until the fantasy feels safer through familiarity. It feels safer to buy into a fantasy, to go after a fantasy, because it's familiar. So it feels more real, even though it's a fantasy. Even if you know it's a fantasy, it feels more real because it's affirmed in so many places around us, and our brain has this association already made. And so people will use this idea of empowerment to have this. It's another way of selling you on empowerment to have and connect to that association. And what I've heard, and I don't know if you've heard this, but I've certainly heard this, where it's, well, people want what's on the other side of change, but they don't want to do the walking through changing part. And so that's why you're not doing the thing that you say you want to do, is because you are resistant to walking through the change. And oftentimes it is blamed on lack of confidence. So, right, you need empowerment to feel more confident, or on laziness. You need accountability to get past this laziness so that you will be willing to step into the uncomfortable and walk through the changing part. But I wonder if it's partly because there's a part of us, that deeper part, that knows that what's on the other side of this change that we're being sold isn't what we're being told it is. But of course, it feels safer in its familiarity to live in the fantasy rather than the disillusionment. So the only way to hold on to the fantasy is by not doing the thing. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we don't do the thing, or why we do just enough of the thing to keep it possible, keep it feeling possible instead of breaking that sense of possibility. So it's not even that we don't want to walk through the change to get the thing that we want. The real issue is that we've been so conditioned around what makes a successful, joyful, empowered life that part of us at least really believes that we want the fantasy. That feels safer. So there's that part of us maybe that knows that it's a fantasy. And then there's the part of us who really wants the fantasy. We really believe that we want that, at least until we've allowed ourselves enough space and openness within ourselves to see beyond all of that programming and imagine another option. So I am going to talk about like imagining another option, though I also want to acknowledge that even when I'm talking about it, for you as an individual, that is very limited and won't actually cover it, because it needs to be a collective imagining, not an individual imagining. We've been doing so much individual imagining, but I think we need to do a little individual imagining to get to the capacity to have a collective imagining. Like, we need to shed some of these options. But then again, I don't know, maybe that's some of my own conditioning. So, another example of this would be like people who say they want a stable job so that they feel secure. But the thing is that a stable job doesn't exist anymore in this society. We're not set up that way. It's not real. For our generation, stability in a profession is not stability in a particular job. It's part of the fantasy. People say that they want movement and fitness and don't believe in fat shaming, and it's not all about being skinny. But what people really want, what grabs attention at least, what makes that association that, oh, I'll feel good in my body, is the fantasy of what that means when you've lost weight. So weight loss, even when you know that's not really supposed to be the goal, because of the familiarity, it's more attractive. The fantasy of what it means when you are thin, when you've lost weight, is attractive. What you think will be different about your life, how you think you'll feel, which is naturally but often unconsciously impacted by how you think you will be perceived and treated differently. So even when people think, well, that's not really what I want, these perceptions are so attractive, because watching people in a fantasy, even when you know it's a fantasy, it still doesn't feel like a fantasy because we've made all of these associations that make it familiar. So you're dealing with your own unconscious bias projected onto other people and assumed to be projected onto you as well. And of course, there's good reason, because the unconscious bias that's there for a reason. It's rooted in societal norms that we are continuously being pushed to uphold. And watching someone who reflects the norm, especially the closer I am to it, I can project myself into that fantasy, and I can imagine that if I were like them, I would be the way I perceive them, and I would have what I perceive they have, and feel the way I imagine I'd feel if those things were true for me. And even if I'm aware all of this is a fantasy, intentionally or unintentionally created between their content and my brain, it becomes attractive. This is that piece that's fueling the comparisonitis, that attraction to something that I think that I want, but it's the surface of what I want, not the real thing that I want. It's a cover over it, playing upon the associations that I've learned to make. Not consciously, but unconsciously. So whether I can have it or not, I can use the fantasy of it, the imagination of it, whether it feels good or feels bad, it's still an escape. It's still stepping into this idea of possibility that is not related to me and my life right now, which usually when I'm caught in something like that, and that comparisonitis, right, it's because something feels uncomfortable, something feels lacking. And so I don't necessarily want to be where I am right now. And so many influencers will create that message, and whether it's influence around services or products or just attention, because we live in a society with attention capitalism where people make money off of holding your attention. Platforms make money off of holding your attention. So it could just be that they're selling your attention. And I'm not saying this is all influencers. This is influencers that are using their lifestyle to sell you on whatever it is. And the message is, this is the life you should want. This is the ideal lifestyle, this fantasy. And then a lot of times it's a fantasy for them too. They're playing into the whole live the life you want before you have it. It's kind of along the lines of dress for the job that you want, not the job that you have. And usually this is living the life that you want before you can even afford it. People will curate what you see because it's what they want. This is a way of them stepping into that fantasy. And it's that whole idea of manifestation. I have an episode on manifestation if you want to check it out. Like, what is actually manifestation? But it's that, well, if I play like I am, if I act as if, then it will happen. I might not have it right now, but I'm going to look like I do so that I can attract it. And ultimately, this is using lifestyle to sell you on the fantasy even further, whether it's actually pushing you to buy anything or just holding your attention. Now, I do also want to clarify here that the issue isn't that people don't share everything that's happening in their life. Like, I'm not necessarily saying, oh, you need to be a hot mess all the time or anything like that. You have to show all the pieces of your life and all the facets of your life. I certainly don't do that because I do believe in privacy as well. The issue that I'm identifying here is using a fictional narrative about your lifestyle to convince people to buy from you, to watch your content, to consume in some way the fantasy. And it does take a lot of privilege to even pretend in this way. But even for those people, it's still a fantasy. And say you're willing to actually walk through the change. And you're like, okay, I'm gonna walk through the change. I'm gonna invest in the change, whether you know it's a fantasy or not, regardless of the direction you're taking. You're like, I'm gonna do work on myself. And I kind of have an issue with this idea of doing work on yourself, even though I talk about it in that way. It's this idea of working because it's effort. Okay, yes, it's effort, but so often doing work on yourself when it's tied to this fantasy involves working hard, pushing yourself, not necessarily listening to yourself, but doing the things you're said, this is what you're supposed to do, versus resting, versus pausing, versus taking some time to process and connect to yourself, to other people truly. Because if you really paused, if you really rested, you would have to actually look at things. Because when you really rest, when you really give yourself space, you start to get present. You start to see more clearly. You start to hear yourself or have the space to hear yourself. But when you do quote unquote work on yourself, especially again, as I said, if you get it from people who are selling the fantasy, then you can live in the fantasy for a while. I'm working toward the fantasy. I'm going to get there. Or you can imagine that if you actually did the work, then you would get to the fantasy, which is why part of you knows and doesn't want to lose that fantasy, so you're not doing the work, right? However, that fantasy is existing for you. And even if it's existing in jealousy, or you're beating yourself up with it through that comparisonitis, right? This is a way of pouring energy into the fantasy in some way. And sure, yes, some people will pay money and quite literally buy into the fantasy, investing in people who are selling through the fantasy intentionally or unintentionally. And I say unintentionally because I do believe that there are some people who are just really bought into it and really believe in that idea of empowering other people. And I speak for myself in that there are aspects of this that are reflected in me and what I've done and how I've shown up, and that I'm engaging. And that's part of the reason I'm processing this in the first place. Sometimes people are really bought in and are using the layers of privilege they have to uphold the fantasy for themselves. So some people will invest because maybe they haven't been disillusioned yet. And I will say this is one of the reasons that I started stepping into these explorations, is because of the disillusionment that I walked through by investing and buying into the fantasy of some of the ways these things work and what empowerment is and all of that. So yes, some people will pay money because it helps them uphold the fantasy for themselves in some way. But again, a lot of people know it's a fantasy, even if it's not conscious, like deep inside they know it, and they don't want to pay money for a fantasy. But they also don't want to pay money to ruin the fantasy. It's hard when you get to a point where you really are trying to be true and present with yourself. It means you're saying, let's take off the rose-colored glasses. Let's look at reality, however stark it may seem. Not because you can't have an amazing life, but because you know that those rose-colored glasses are lies. It's built on fantasy. It's built on imagination and lies. And you actually want to imagine in a way that allows you to build something true. And that does involve really looking at where you actually are, where we actually are, what is actually true. Because until we are willing to face what is true and actually look at it, we can't really build anything different. We can't actually create change. And the fact of the matter is that when you do that, when you're really willing to look at it, even when it seems stark and it's not nearly as pretty as the fantasy of what we're sold, it's so much better on so many levels when you step out of the illusion. Because while the future is unpredictable, while you don't actually know what will happen when you truly engage yourself, mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, communal, when you actually get present, it might ruin the fantasy. And it might not seem to be as immediately beautiful, but you have power again. You have a power to do something different, to create change, and to truly connect, to truly live your life instead of chasing life. And I guess, that's what we really want when we think about empowerment, but we keep going after the fantasy of empowerment because it's what makes sense. It's what has the associations in our brain. It's what's familiar. But to step out of that means that we could actually create something different. And I think the hard part is that different might not be in our lifetime. It might be in our children's lifetime or our children's children's lifetime. And I think that's hard to engage. I know it is for me. At the same time, it also means that I can live my life more fully and more present and more connected. So to recap, we've been conditioned to think empowerment looks like societal privilege. And honestly, in many ways, in this space, in this society, it does. But it's not the only possibility. Yet, if that's what we think empowerment looks like, that's what we look for. That's what we compare to. And that's what people selling things learn to use to sell us on. They feed our implicit biases and push us to buy into the societal narratives. To step out of that, to break that fantasy, when so much of what we know is built around it, can feel a little bit like breaking your life, like knocking everything down. And who wants to do that? I mean, that's hard. That's scary. The American filmmaker Ava DuVernay said, "I think a lot less about breaking down his door or shattering his ceiling, more about building my own house." This quote is used in a Women Belong networking group that I was in just recently. And I think it ties very much into this conversation. The door, the ceiling are all part of this fantasy house, this lifestyle, societal norms, all of that. So what does it look like to build your own house? This is stepping into that unknown space, the space that may seem stark because it's like empty land or whatever. And honestly, it's something that I'm still working on. I'm too close to many of the privileges that the fantasies that I too have been conditioned with to naturally see them clearly. And it's why I try to stay in a learning space, in a mindset of growing and learning instead of like expertness. I have found that many of the tools I have help me lean into unknown and uncomfortable spaces and to show up to real transformative change, to showing up to building and helping build a different house. Which is why I say, I'm not here to empower you. I'm not here to help you become societally powerful. I am here to embrace living, embrace joy, and walk with you into the unknown. And I don't think that that's something that you can do just from working with me. I think I can help you with it, but it's not a one-to-one sort of thing. It means stepping into community because it means a communal shift. So when we think about empowerment, the kind of empowerment through conscious, intentional engagement cannot be found only in understanding ourselves, but must also include understanding our relationship to power in a societal system. Now, I'm going to break down briefly what that means because I mentioned it, I think, in the last episode, and I've talked about it in some posts recently, but I realized through the workshop I did with Amina Chaudhry how much people don't understand systems, societal systems. So society is a large group of people whose members have developed organized patterns of relationships through interaction with one another. A social system is the patterned series of interrelationships existing between individuals, groups, and institutions and forming a coherent whole. Social structure are the rules built up by persons living within a group, especially with regard to the hierarchical organization of status and to the rules and principles regulating behavior. Most of our societal rules are unspoken, these things that build up this idea of what this fantasy is. They're unspoken and unconsciously internalized, including the dynamics of individualism. So often we're going to individualize things that are not individual. It's like if you have ever done any work around taking things personally that really aren't personal, it's like that. That's individualism. It's all rooted in all of that. And as Amina pointed out, we typically only notice these rules when they're not adhered to or when they don't work for us. So I do think this fantasy, so many of these constructs based in hierarchies that create this fantasy but really are dehumanizing. They dehumanize all of us. Of course, to be clear, I'm not making an equivalency regarding the harm of these constructs. They are directly harmful in much greater ways to folks whose identities are more marginal to the norms of this society. And because they don't work, because they're rooted in fantasy, because they are harmful, you may begin to be able to find them in the places that aren't working. So in those places where you're like, I'm not doing the thing, I feel stuck, or where you're getting caught in the self-doubt and the comparisonitis and those sorts of spaces, you may be able to find some of the rules embedded in there. So I'm going to wrap up with the idea of taking some of these places where you are doing comparisons in a way that is not helpful to you and turning that comparison into a self-reflection, because there's a reason you're making the comparison. So asking yourself some questions as you notice what's not working, as you notice the comparing that you're doing, because that is an indication that something may be missing, or that you're basically measuring yourself to another person based off of the rules of the society. So you can start to see the cracks in the fantasy, in the structure, in the way that it's not serving. So take a look at, when you notice this, what do I feel like I'm lacking? What feels like not enough? What is feeding that? What do I really want? What are people doing to get what I really want? Looking at what actually works in this system. Because while we still live in it, we do need to understand what is working and how is it working. The more we can understand the dynamics of it, the more we are aware of how we are part of it and how it's showing up in our lives and how we're showing up to it in our lives. So really looking at what's going on here and how much do I really know? Because oftentimes we're comparing apples and oranges, but we're also sometimes comparing an elephant's foot with its trunk. We're looking at one piece and comparing one piece of our life to one piece of somebody else's life. But again, that comparison is being done in a way that is tied to the rules, tied to the structure, because that's why we would make the comparison. So noticing, what is that? And how does what I really want intersect with the outcome I think I'm looking for? That goal, this is the thing I want, but thinking about, what do I really want? What do I think I'll have when I get this outcome? That's what you really want. And so how does that tie to the outcome? And what does that look like to get it in this system? And what impact does that have if I get it that way in this system? Because it may shift the strategy. Maybe somebody is getting it in this way that works in the system, but is that really what you want to create? How does that intersect with the impact that you want to have? This is why when I do visioning, and I've said this so many times, but I'll say it again. This is why when I do visioning, we talk about, how do you want to experience life? How do you want to show up to life? And what impact do you want to make? Because all three of those things matter. And then what would help me think outside the box? When I'm looking at these pieces and I recognize, why am I making this comparison? What's going on here? What am I actually comparing? What is leading me to make this comparison? What feels like it's lacking? What do I actually have? And what are the dynamics in the system that relate to this? It's necessary to look at our societal programming in order to properly evaluate our internal wants and perceptions, as well as to reflect on the emotional charge of all of this, because it informs what we perceive about others, what we perceive about ourselves, and what we think we want in relation to all of that. So unfortunately, it's not like a linear 1, 2, 3 kind of process that seems easier. But again, that also fits within these structures. It's an evolving process. It's kind of all over the place. And it means pausing and giving yourself space to meet yourself where you're at and to actually listen. So hopefully this has given you some things to chew on. I don't think this is something that will all gel immediately. I think it's something that we just need to chew on. I know I'm chewing on it. I mean, I still use the term empowerment because it fits. It's what most people are familiar with. And So to be able to help people step in, you do need to use things that are familiar, right? But to be able to unpack the ways that these internalized rules impact us as individuals means some of this work of the empowerment concept. Like, how do you access choice? How do you step into your own power? And I think there are aspects of that before we can access the collective. But I also think we need the collective to be able to access that. It's a give and take. It's a collaboration. And as I continue to bring social rules and my relationship to them to consciousness, I find myself less attached to the term empowerment. So while I'm still using it, I feel less and less attached to it. I feel more aligned with the term liberation. I believe we cannot truly be free while our freedom is dependent on others' oppression. Liberation requires collective empowerment, not just individual empowerment. So I encourage you to look at those spaces in your life. And I hope that some of the concepts around noticing will be helpful. It's one of the biggest tools, just giving yourself enough space to notice. It's one of the things that I do with clients, is helping them create space to notice, to connect dots to noticing that we can't just do on our own. I also don't think that working with a coach is the solution to all the things. I think it can help. But it also means finding community and creating an intentional community. Sometimes to do that, we need to do some self-healing so that we can start to attract the people we want to be in community with and have that discernment. So as I said at the beginning of this, I invite you to reach out. I would love to hear what this brought up for you. If you have thoughts, if it brings forward questions or ideas, what your relationship to this exploration is in your own life. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you would like support in some of this exploration, some of the ways that I do work with people, or if you want to explore what that could look like for you, I would be happy to speak with you on that as well. But it doesn't have to be the same thing. There are links in the show notes to some resources and also to connect with me. So please feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear from you. And I'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening. I so appreciate you being here. If you got something out of today's episode, please share it. Leave me a review, take a screenshot, and post it on social with a shout out to me. Send it to a friend or, all of the above. Want to hang out more? Join me on Instagram. Or better yet, get on my mailing list to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And remember, your possibilities are as unlimited as you are. Allow yourself to shine, my friend. The world needs your light. See you next time.